You're listening to the Business Wealth Impact Podcast, your source for empowering information and cutting-edge ideas from the world's top minds. I'm your host, Jeanne Amlour, founder of seven-figure coaching company, Jeanne Amlour International. Join me on a journey to unleash your potential and create your highest success. Welcome to Business Wealth Impact. Hello, and welcome to another episode. Today we have Reid as a guest. Roy's an executive coach and author of The Trust Transformation, and he helps leaders to implement trust as their leadership operating system. Welcome to the show, Roy.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Great to have you here. Okay, so let's again dig into this immediately with no further ado. Why is trust important, first of all?
Well, trust is essential in building sustainable relationships, and everybody needs to at least take inventory of where it stands in the relationship. Yeah, a lot of people ask me, what's the biggest mistake a leader makes when it comes to trust? And it's they assume it. They assume that it's there. If you're, say, an executive in an organization, you assume because you have this title, people are going to trust you, and you rush headlong into whatever that work is, and without doing the proper relationship building and structure, you find yourself oftentimes facing things like turnover, customers not necessarily really staying with you and leaving for the next price cut that they get from your competitors. And so what we want to do is create sustainable trust, lasting trust, and trust not only in the workplace, but also at home. And so we look at this as a whole person experience and looking at trust not as a fragile or fleeting emotion, but really as your operating system.
Okay, so how does this all work?
Well, the first thing we really want people to understand is how trust works. We talk about it. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. We see that in society today, there's a lack of trust in institutions and people. And so when we take it apart and look at the smaller pieces of it, the first thing that we became aware of is that it's really driven on two primary drivers, an emotional driver and an experiential driver. So when we have that first initial engagement with people, we might make a connection with them, and that's usually one of emotion. But how do you sustain that over time? And what are you doing to make that happen? And so from those two big drivers, then we identified what are the four attributes for transformational trust. And it begins with being trustworthy, sort of at the intersection of the emotion and the experience. And this is really how much and how deep is the trust you have within yourself. And so within trustworthiness, we look at the idea of integrity and attitude as really two of the big drivers. You know, what do you subscribe to that determines how you make your decisions? And when you're engaging with people, how are you engaging with people? And what does that look like? And then up the emotional side of the scale, we dig into the idea of authenticity when it comes to the relationships we're building with other people. And we look at the areas of respect and candor and really clarity in what that relationship is supposed to be. And that's much more on the emotional side, as I said. Down the experiential plane, we look at the attribute of dependability. And are you giving a consistent, reliable performance in the things that you do? And then lastly, when those three things are in place and you have a foundation of trust, the gift of trust, or the fourth attribute is influence. And with influence, we want to take a look at and encourage people to really understand, how am I making a difference in where I'm at, within my own self, within the people around me, the people that I both work for and work with.
Okay, so lots of keywords. I heard clarity, candor, we have authenticity, dependability, trustworthiness, influence. So for now, I'm just thinking there's a lot of words, right? How do people, there must be some evaluation to see where people fall in those and how do they fix it all? How do you say, gee, am I dependable? Am I trustworthy? It's a lot. And I feel like your system is the system of how to figure out all that out. Is that what it is?
Absolutely.
Good.
So
Great.
as I mentioned before, when we begin opening up the idea of how trust works, the second thing that we really want people to understand is the condition that you just we're really kind of asking about, what are the condition of my relationships? And we give them a scale to really look at and say, in your relationships, are the people or the individuals, are they advocates? Are they people that are really tied in tight, close to you, have a high level of trust? And we have a group like that. And then we look at the next part of the scale as allies. So not quite as strong as your advocates, but they're there, supportive, and generally aligned. The largest of the group we call agnostic. And these are sort of the people that you don't have a relationship with. Perhaps you've got a new person on your team. You've acquired a new customer. Your new neighbors moved in. What are those relationships like? And then lastly, we look at a category we call adversaries. And this category, trust is maybe broken, or there's just that friction that exists that prevents you from having the better relationship. Uh, and it's important to understand too that this spectrum is not one of judgment, but one of condition. And so there are people on that scale that you identify perhaps as an adversary. You're never going to give them your full trust, but you can create a relationship with them. Those would be like competitors in your
Mm,
business that you don't want to be seen as nasty or bad in that, but you can never give them that full trust. And even on the
mm,
advocate scale, you can have really close friends, but maybe they're not a good influence. But as
mm,
I reflect on where that scale is, now the question is, what can I do to improve that relationship? What can I do to lean into that? And so one of the early exercises that we'll give the executive, or if we're training a team, is to identify three people, each from one of those scales, and ask the questions, what can I do to really build trust with them? What are some of the words that you identified earlier, that I shared earlier, that I can lean into? And so really the model is giving them a much smaller area of diagnosis to look at in that relationship and say, what can I lean into? And so that opens up the idea that within that framework, we now lay on a set of guiding principles that say, when I'm
mm,
engaging with somebody, I'm going to build trust from the inside out. I'm going to work on myself, and I'm going to determine what can I do to lean into it. The second is I'm going to take responsibility for the relationship. I recognize that I can't change somebody. They have to make that decision, but I can take accountability for what I'm doing in that relationship to move the needle on trust.
mm.
And the third, and this aligns with that idea of dependability, is I'm going to keep my promises and communicate consistently. Because in everything we can do, sometimes we're going to fall short. But as long as we're communicating, we can manage expectations. And then lastly, we say, I'm going to be a good steward of this trust. I'm going to honor it. I'm going to be aware of it. I'm going to stay engaged, be intentional about it. But I'm also going to think about, who am I inviting into my life to influence the way I see it and the way I act about it?
Okay, so if we develop all of this, actually it leads to influencing people because the people then trust and are open to your words.
Mhm.
Is that correct? And your
Yeah.
actions.
In a sense, you hit on a good point, because leadership is influence. When you're a leader, you have that influence, and so now how do you act on it? What do you do with it?
Right, right. Now, when you're saying, be more authentic, be more, lean in. Lean in. When I hear the word lean in, that's not do anything. Leaning in is a very sort of like weak word to me. No offense, because we hear that a lot in leadership. Okay. So when you say to somebody, hey, you got to lean into your authenticity, they'd be thinking, what do you mean? Right. So let's pretend it's somebody that doesn't know what you mean by lean in. How does somebody not lean in? How does somebody develop their authenticity to then gain trust of other people? Because that's a really important point, I think.
Sure.
What's the how to, right?
Right. So there's six ingredients to real authenticity. Number one is you have to have clarity in the relationship. What is the context of that relationship, and what is your role in that relationship? What are you responsible for in that
Hmm.
relationship? The second ingredient is respect. So when you engage with that person, you want to cultivate that level of respect. And what does that mean? In a sense, it means you can have contentious arguments about things. You can fight about things as well in a really authentic relationship, as long as everybody leaves with their dignity. And so we want to
Mm,
exercise that respect in all the engagement that we have. The third thing that we talk about here is candor. You have to develop candor in a relationship for it to truly be authentic. You have to be able to say the truth, speak into it, allow people and give them permission to do that with you as well, and do it with respect. And so each of these are building on each other. The fourth thing that we talk about in there too is forgiveness. In our relationships, we have to have the ability both to forgive ourselves, to be able to move forward, but also learn lessons when we may be mistreated. If we have to separate from that person, that's fine, but let go of the things that hold us back from creating those stronger relationships with people. And when all of those things are present, there's transparency in the relationship. You're consistent with both what I say and what I do. And so
Mm-hmm.
those are the ingredients for having that authentic relationship.
Mm-hmm. Easier said than done. So I feel like that's like a masterclass of life you're talking about here, because
Yeah.
we both know that it's really hard for people to make changes. It's just hard, right?
Right.
And if you said to somebody, you need to do this, 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 and this, they're overwhelmed. So I'm guessing that you help them do those one by one and evaluate, because people are overwhelmed. And if you're going to give them, you're not going to be authentic, you got to get clear, you got to do this, they'd be just like, whoa, how do I do that? So let's just break this down a bit, just for argument's sake. Let's say you're working with somebody and you're like, okay, bro, you need to be you need to be more authentic. And the guy says, or the woman says, how? Okay. And you're like, well, you got to do the clarity, blah, blah, blah. How do they start that? How do they even start that? That's such a big job if somebody's not authentic. If somebody's not acting in an authentic way, you can't just say, go do this and now you're going to be authentic, because there's clearly a problem already where they've reached a point where they're completely not authentic. There's habits, there's all of that history of how they got to where they are, where they are not being authentic. And if
Mhm.
they weren't being authentic, there's a reason why. It's not that they just don't want to be authentic, right? So, what's the first step to somebody that's just like a mess and says, wow, I really need to learn from Roy? Where do you start?
Well, first of all, it begins with really looking at your integrity, right? So coming out of all of this, each of the attributes build on one another. So to get to authenticity, you have to first really understand, ask the questions, and confront the ideas about your own integrity and attitude and get those in alignment.
Okay, so let's just stop right there. So the first thing is to take stock, maybe, of how am I acting?
Right. Build
And
trust from the inside out. You start here.
right. So there has to be some audit with oneself, right? Like,
Mhm.
okay, what am I doing here? Let's see. Am I being not authentic? Because that's a sort of vague word. Am I being like trustworthy with
You have to
people?
be
Am I being
trustworthy before you can be authentic.
right? Right. So do I have integrity? How am I acting? So isn't it some sort of self questionnaire and questioning of an audit? I'd say before we can get through these keywords. Do you have
Well,
some sort of
we start we
questionnaire?
yeah, we start with the awareness and we get them
Mm,
engaged in that, and we take them through a couple of series of activities within the framework of the program that start to unpack that. And then I do have an online audit that people can take, 20 questions that take a look at a variety of different ways that your relationships show up in your personal and professional life, and then corresponding questions that go with that that give you a 1 to 100 scale on where you stand in terms of how trust is showing up in your life. And I can send that to you and make it available.
that's what I thought. I thought there has to be some audit. So you
Yeah,
already covered that one. Okay, so what would you say? Would you say now what got you to this? Why a book about trust? What's your journey to this that made
sure.
this your thing?
It started probably around 2007. I was a partner in a public relations firm and was confronted with the idea of how do I help my clients understand that the outcome of every communication that we put out should improve trust with that audience. And that led to a question then is, well, how do you define trust? What does it look like? And then that opened up this whole can of worms that really became obsessed on. Ended up
Mm,
leaving the agency and went to work at the local university's College of Business, where I could kind of play around with the ideas, test them out, explore them. And by the time I was about to end my time there, I was training the teams in this model that I had created. And then I was recruited to go to work for Advent Health, which is a large national healthcare organization. And I partnered with them, with their education team and their publishing team, recruited Dr. Omira Mansfield because we really started to look through the lens of how does improving our relationships improve our results, not just in our workplace, but in our home? How can I,
Mm,
get the same results with my wife, with my kids, as I'm getting with my coworkers and my boss? And in 2017, after an extensive amount of research and diving into this, we launched what we call the Trust Transformation. And so it's an
mm,
evidence based training program. And probably to date, the system has run about 7,000 people through the program. I
mm,
then started working with teams within the system and leadership teams and looking at where we can apply this at that level. And so
mhm,
as I started training the leadership teams, and then as an outcome of that training, they produce, they write, and they adopt what we call a trust contract that becomes part of their cultural construct with mission, vision, values, service standard, trust contract. What kind of outcomes would we see there? And they were
mm,
extraordinary. And so one
mm,
of the hospitals that we went into, the team had acquired that hospital from another company. When they went
mhm,
in there, two numbers stood out. They were in the lowest 5% for patient satisfaction and the lowest 5% for hospital based infections. We took the team to the program. They adopted the trust contract. And 15 months later, when I interviewed the CEO, both of those numbers had flipped. They were now in the
mm,
upper 60% on patient satisfaction, and they were close to 80% improvement on the hospital-based infections. And when he came to see me, they had been 6 months with 0. And so I
mm.
asked him, "How do you attribute this as an operating system to your outcomes?" And he said, "When trust when trust is measurably higher with our teams, people aren't afraid to speak up when something's wrong. People are
Ah,
more willing to step into that. We retain our best people. We're able to move those out who don't subscribe to what we're doing. And we just have a much better culture now in everything that we have."
wow. Okay, you just blew my mind. I just realized it was the fact that they were afraid to say, "Hey, something's going on that's wrong here," because I'm afraid of getting in trouble.
Right.
So, along that does make sense. I thought, how would that work? That does make sense because then, well, I trust you that I can tell you, hey, you know what? Even though you're a senior doctor, you made a mistake here
Yeah.
and we got to fix that. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas in hospitals, there's this whole hierarchy that you're not allowed to tell a senior doctor they made, even though they have,
Yeah.
which is to the detriment of the patients,
Yeah.
obviously.
When
Okay. So
everybody
what?
safety
Mm,
is likely the highest expression of trust in the workplace.
mm, wow. Okay. So what happened in your life with your marriage when you did this? Let's hear that.
Well, my story is it's big. We had launched this program in 2017. In 2019, I had my own personal trauma experience where this all got put to work at the highest level. I had what's called an acute aortic dissection. And for your
Mm,
listeners, that's not a heart attack. That's when your aorta splits open. And if you don't get to the emergency room immediately and into surgery, you're going to bleed out. And in my case, I was asleep when it happened. My wife and I jump in the car. I have a stroke on the way to the hospital. I'm non responsive. When I get there, they figure out what's wrong. They fly me from one hospital to the other, 6 hours of surgery to essentially replace the entire upper arch of my aorta. So now 30% of my heart is synthetic material. The damage was so bad. The belief was that there was no prognosis for a positive outcome. And they put me in a coma just to see if
mm,
my body will start to recover for a week. And so for a week,
mm,
nobody knows what's going to happen. After that, I wake up, I have my faculties. A lot of this is miraculous, but I was able to get up and start my recovery. And every day I had to lean into the idea of really rebuilding trust first with myself. Could I live the life I needed to? Was I going to subscribe to the right diet, exercise,
mm,
focus, and all the other things? Or was I going to move the things out that had an adverse effect on me? And then you begin to discover a lot of shortcomings in your own personal life. At home,
mm,
there were a lot of things that I had to work through with my wife, my kids, just kind of putting things back in order. Work had obsessed me, taken a big toll on me, and I'd allowed that to happen. And then
mm,
even when I returned to work 6 months later, actually it was almost a year later, when you account for another surgery I had to go through, had to start that process there too. But I got there, and I got there in a variety of different ways. And one of the ways that I like to tell people is within about a year and a half, after having started walking 15 minutes a day and barely making it, to then about a year and a half later completing a half marathon to do that.
Mm.
And so one of the lessons that I want people to take away is when we build that trust in ourselves and we're intentional about doing it and we live up to that integrity of investing in that every day, we have much greater resilience. And so one of the outcomes of this is that individually you create resilience, and in the team around you, you create resilience when that level of trust increases.
Wow, what a story. And you didn't even know what was going on. That's so scary. And I must have been extremely scary because when your body doesn't do what you want it to and you have no idea what's going on, that's the scariest feeling in the world,
Yeah,
right?
when you wake up and it feels like someone's punching a hole through your chest and squeezing the life out of you, it's definitely transformational.
Right. Now, did you build the trust thing after that or had you started already to work on
No,
this?
no, no. The model started in 2007. We launched the
Okay.
program at Advent Health in 2017, and I had
Mm,
my issue in 2019. And so
okay.
it really was ironic that here I was in a condition where I had to apply everything that I'd been teaching other people to do in my life at a
Mm,
level that I could have never imagined. And
mm,
so, when I reflect on it today, I tell people it's the best thing that ever happened to me because it now gives me both the focus and inspiration to say, I have to tell people about this. I have to share this story. We hadn't yet published the book. And so in 2022, after the pandemic had subsided, after the healthcare system kind of came back into balance, and I looked around and surveyed where I was, the clear message was I needed to move on and move out and move up to a place where I could create a platform and share this with a much larger audience. And so I
mm,
started my coaching business in earnest in 2022 and
mhm,
coming out of the gates began working with, I worked with Orlando International Airport, one of the largest airports in the country, with the American Pet Products Association, helping those organizations really take a better look inside as to how they could build that kind of culture and,
mm.
and really transform their organizations to a different place.
Okay, so to recap, people need to get more trustworthy, be people that instill trust, have people trust them,
Mhm.
and then they get influence and we make more money and we have better relationships. That's the recap, right?
Right. And and
Yeah.
and really understanding that trust isn't again a fragile emotion, but it can be your true leadership operating system.
Mm,
And the last thing I'd want to share with people is every little thing that you say and do is either contributing to or taking away from the trust people have. So if you become more intentional about your words and the actions on a day to day basis, just that alone is going to transform the relationships that you have in your life.
okay, I love that because that's the nitty gritty. The nitty gritty is everything you say and do, somebody is watching and
Yep.
it's affecting somebody. And I do agree. I feel like some people aren't that aware that not being reliable, that speaks volumes and people remember that even just being late
Mm,
and it might seem like nothing, but the other person is affected and they're like, okay, now that person's a late person in my mind. And it
right.
doesn't instill trust, right? It does
That's right.
not if somebody's always late. Okay, well, thank you so much for turning up, Roy. This has been great. Thank you for listening if you're listening. And if you want, some people are not subscribing, I hear. If you like what you hear, you might have forgotten, just go and subscribe. And if you really like it, maybe write a review. Okay, take care and we'll see you on the next one. You're listening to the Business Wealth Impact Podcast, your source for empowering information and cutting edge ideas from the world's top minds. I'm your host, Jean Amlour, founder of seven-figure coaching company, Jean Amlour International. Join me on a journey to unleash your potential and create your highest success. Welcome to Business Wealth Impact.